Good morning and afternoon, and thank you all for holding. All participants will be able to listen only until the question and answer session of today's call, at which time, if you'd like to ask a question, you may press star followed by 1 on your touch-tone phone. You will be prompted to record your name prior to asking your question. Today's call is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the call over to the Honorable Jane Harmon, Director, President, and CEO of the Wilson Center. Ma'am, you may begin.
Thank you, Operator. Good morning to any on the West Coast. Matt Rajansky is one of those people. Good morning to people. I'm calling in from Aspen. Good lunchtime to those on the East Coast, and I'm not sure what time of day it is where others are calling. We have a lot of people on the line. There's intense interest in this issue, and this is a time when I am so proud of the deep bench at the Wilson Center. I often call it an intellectual candy store, and right now is where we need the most sober and thoughtful and deep scholarship and insight on where this moment will lead. I'm in Aspen, just arrived here half an hour ago from Washington, left Washington this morning at 5 o'clock in the morning, to co-chair an advisory group on Homeland Security with former Secretary of Homeland Security Michael Chertoff, and that leads into the annual security forum here, which will for sure not only involve very high-level administration officials and intelligence community officials, both current and former, but will raise many of the issues we're going to discuss today. The ground truth briefing format is extremely useful and efficient, we find at the Wilson Center. I think this is our 122nd or 123rd ground truth briefing in the last several years, and we're very proud of what we do. And I don't want to take any more time except to say, as I think I did, that this is a very sober time in the world, and we have to understand what it means, and we have to think forward about where it leads. And there is no better group to assess that than those on the call. And I don't recall, please remind me, folks, who is moderating this session, but I am now pleased to turn this over to our moderator, who I'm sure is one of our, as I would say, geniuses at the Wilson Center.
Well,
who is it?
Thank you very much, Jane. This is
it's Will.
Yes.
Will Pomerantz.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center, and I would like to welcome everyone in Washington and around the world to this Ground Truth Briefing. Today's discussion will center on yesterday's summit in Helsinki and what its implications are for the future of U.S.-Russian relations. Before we get started, I'd like to mention that this conversation, along with podcasts of previous Ground Truth Briefings, can be downloaded at wilsoncenter.org. I'd also like to encourage you to follow the Kennan Institute on Twitter and Facebook at Kennan Institute and facebook.com/kennan.institute. And today, as Jane mentioned, we are joined by 3 outstanding analysts and followers of events in Russia and around the world. I will give brief bios of the 3 speakers and then throw it open to them for their comments, and then we'll finally open up for your questions as well. The first speaker is Jill Doherty, who has served as CNN correspondent for 3 decades, reporting from more than 50 countries, including Afghanistan, Iraq, North Korea, and Russia. She is a distinguished visiting practitioner at the University of Washington's Evans School of Public Policy and Governance, a global fellow here at the Kennan Institute, and a CNN contributor who provides expert commentary on Russia. She will be followed by Jeff Edmonds. Jeff is a research scientist at CNA and a global fellow at the Kennan Institute. His research focuses on Russian military, foreign policy, and Russian information and cyber operations. Most recently, he served as Director for Russia on the National Security Council and Acting Senior Director for Russia during the 2017 presidential transition. Prior to the NSC, Jeffrey Edmonds served as a military analyst with the Central Intelligence Agency, covering Eurasian militaries. He has served in the U.S. Army on both active duty and the reserves, and for 22 years with tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Our third speaker will be Matthew Rajansky, who is the director of the Kennan Institute and an expert on U.S. relations with the states of the former Soviet Union, especially Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. Previously, Mr. Rajansky was deputy director of the Russia and Eurasia program at Carnegie. He has also served as an embassy policy specialist at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, Ukraine, and a visiting scholar in the research division at the NATO Defense College. He is also an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University SAIS and serves as U.S. Executive Secretary for the Dartmouth Conference, a track to U.S.-Russian conflict resolution initiative begun in 1960. As Jane alluded to, we do live in interesting times, and I think yesterday's summit will be particularly remembered as an event that has precipitated much conversation as to the direction of U.S.-Russian relations and what does this mean in the near term for the relations between these two countries. So, as we turn to our speakers now, I'd ask them all three to discuss what yesterday's events in Helsinki means for U.S.-Russian relations, and we'll begin with Jill Doherty.
Thank you very much, Will. It's almost hard to really capture this because so much happened yesterday. I personally have been doing some live shots on television, and I would have to say I don't think I've ever seen quite as emotional reaction, a complete furor to what any political leader has ever said, let alone the President of the United States. Obviously, a lot of the furor was engendered by the comments by President Trump, which appeared to be siding with Putin instead of the U.S. intelligence agencies when he said, I don't see any reason why it would be Russia interfering in the U.S. election in 2016, and noting that Putin had a strong and powerful denial. So now part of this I do think is certainly sincere. There has been also an element of high dudgeon, I think, on the side of many people who have raised this to the emotional level very, very high. And the Russians, in their answering on their social media and some of the state-allied or state-controlled media, have kind of fired back. RT television, for example, is pretty much mocking what they call the hysterical hot take that's coming on Twitter from people who, as they would say, cannot accept that the two countries would work together. So there's, in addition to what concretely happened, I think that you have to look at the media, the way that this is being presented by the media, which takes it to another level. I think leaving aside specifics, I'd have to say that Russia is very pleased. President Putin must be very pleased, I think, by how things went. Certainly, after the meeting of the two men, the two leaders, there were statements from the Russians essentially saying that, Russia is back. Russia's president and the U.S. president are deciding the fate of the world. One quote mentioned, one tweet by Alexei Pushkov, a senator, noted that they are the heads of the leading powers of the planet are deciding the fate of the world. So Russia certainly, I think, would have to feel that primary, number one, that they are now considered one of the deciders in the world yet again. After the Soviet Union, they are now back on the stage, and witness the President of Russia, President of the United States, flags behind them, looking all kind of like the old days for influence of Russia. Certainly even the word summit as opposed to meeting would give that impression. Now, there were some specifics, and I think actually probably more than we might expect in that meeting. We still don't know exactly what happened, but judging by what President Putin said, you do have some indications that there are new commissions, kind of bilateral commissions that could come about on cybersecurity and business, and certainly perhaps some steps on arms control. I do think, however, that Russia is trying to depict this as the end of the Cold War, a big turning point in the relationship. Here in the United States, I think it is virtually impossible that will happen because any steps that would move toward Russia could very well be stymied by this political furor, which is not only Democrats but some Republicans as well, maybe even more sanctions. So overall, I think I'd end on this, that the trip, this has to be, I think, presented in terms of the trip of the President of the United States, his meeting with the NATO allies, his comments about the EU as a foe, meetings in Britain, etc. I think Europe is not, quite frankly, stunned at this point, not sure what's happening. NATO allies in the Baltics are probably quaking in their boots, not quite sure what is happening. And I think overall, as Jane indicated right at the top, this is a period of more destabilization, more chaos, and that will have ramifications going forward. More countries will feel, or at least question, whether the United States will be there for them. It could lead to, let's say, more unity among the Europeans, feeling that they can't count on the United States leadership. And you even could have, in other parts of the world, more of a push toward nuclearization, the very opposite of what most people want, as certain countries feel that the United States is no longer playing the role that it did in the past. So I'll leave it at that, Will.
Thanks so much, Jill. Jeff Edmonds.
Great. Thanks, Will, and thanks for having me on today. This is a great event. I think the press conference is just extremely regrettable. I think to dismiss the ICEA analysis, to reject hours of selfless service by thousands of analysts who are not political and who are very confident, and to equate that with Putin just denying election meddling is really regrettable. One thing that's come out of this that really bothers me, and Rand Paul has talked about this, is this false dichotomy between talking to the Russians and holding them accountable for election meddling. I mean, the president should have held Putin accountable. There's no doubt about that at all, but that doesn't mean we can't speak to the Russians. There are important things that we need to talk about. I think we have to be very careful going forward. Putin's offer to have some kind of agreement between the countries or to use these agreements is very typical of the Russian leadership to create a problem and then offer to solve it for us. And so I think we have to be very careful when it comes to that. As for the relationship going forward, I mean, the Russians, maybe he's not reading his briefs, but we're pretty clear on why the Russians meddle in our elections, and will continue to do so, and that's because they always viewed us as meddling in their elections. And I don't see that view changing. I think that's a very deeply held view, and it's unfortunate that they have that, but I think that's going to guide their behaviors going forward. And so I think we're going to continue to see this. But again, like I said, all of that being in place, it's, each administration that comes in likes to think that a certain personality will fix this relationship. There are deep divides in the way the Russian leadership and the American leadership see the world, and I don't see those changing anytime soon. And so we really don't need any more resets. I think it's better going forward that we have a very sober view, manage our expectations to kind of enable us to get to the hard work of actually addressing issues of strategic stability. And I'll leave it with that.
Thanks, Jeff. Matt.
Yeah, well, first, I want to endorse everything that Jeff has just said regarding the, if you will, the politics of Russian election interference. I think it's exactly right that we are taking what is an exceptionally difficult problem, one that is probably not solvable, probably not even solvable through direct negotiations with Russia, in other words, striking a deal on mutual non-interference. But we're making it much, much worse by eliding this problem of why Russia hacks us, why Russia has a bone to pick with American democracy, with the problem of how you conduct relations with Russia. At the end of the day, there's a lot of stuff we don't like that China does, or that any other major country in the world does. Some of it gets to some pretty big concerns for the American economy or for American national security, and yet there's always going to be a long list of issues that if we don't manage those issues effectively in our interactions with those countries, we lose net much more than we gain. And that's the trap I feel, frankly, both parties are falling into now. Certainly the president exacerbates this by just combining the issue of what the Russians did and whether there was collusion every time the question comes up. Setting collusion aside, there's plenty of evidence that the Russians interfered in the election, and that's clearly something that the public and Washington is crying out for him to address directly with the Russians. Side note on the White House press corps, I got to say I was kind of disappointed. It reminded me, Will, you might appreciate this, early days as a lawyer, the first thing you learn is, if the witness is not going to give you the answer you want, don't ask it 5 more times expecting a different answer. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the questions in the presser yesterday were missed opportunities where more could have been gotten from that one-on-one meeting by simply asking more about the content of the meeting rather than just repeating the question over and over, will you condemn Russian interference? Will you condemn Russian interference? A couple of notes on what I understand to have been discussed, because I think this is what matters. Putin described in much greater detail in a stand-up one-on-one interview that he gave to Russian state television a pretty substantive agenda. So he talked in particular about discussions about southern Syria. It sounded like there was maybe a proposal or even an agreement in the offing to somehow get Iranian forces out of the region that is in the Syrian part of the Golan Heights, maybe even beyond that region, back them up from the Israeli and Lebanese border areas. This was of obvious concern to Israel. Putin mentioned that Israel had been consulted on this. So that really starts to smell like a pre-cooked international proposal, if not a finalized deal. That obviously would be very significant. The quid pro quo for that, though, and it's implied without even needing to be confirmed by the American side, is Assad has effectively retaken 90% of Syria, and Putin underscored that fact. So this is basically about recognizing the reality that Assad is in control, but in exchange trying to push the Iranians back from their furthest advanced positions. Second, Putin talked about Ukraine. He referred to an interesting proposal on Ukraine. Now, that could be a throwaway line, although usually everything Putin says is calculated, so I suspect that something at least nominally new came up on Ukraine. It may have been around the peacekeeping issue. It may have been something aimed at reinvigorating the Minsk agreements. In any case, any movement on Ukraine to try to tamp down the fighting there, to try to get the ceasefire actually in place would be a positive step, especially when you consider that we are effectively in election season for Ukraine itself. There are going to be both parliamentary and presidential elections. Lots of incentives for spoilers on both sides of that conflict, and people are still dying. So that's another area where, the business to be done by the United States and Russia, if we can talk to each other effectively, if we can engage the Ukrainians and our European allies, is a very big deal. That was clearly discussed, a point that's largely been missed in the aftermath of this summit. And then lastly, this has been noted, and in fact, Putin noted it in his opening to the press conference, but he said much more about it in his stand-up interview, and that's a working group between American and Russian business leaders. Now, American and Russian business leaders talk to each other with relative frequency. They've got the U.S.-Russia Business Council and the American Chamber of Commerce in Russia, but obviously this is a severely deteriorated economic relationship. To some extent, that's been intentional on the Western side. We want to use the relationship for leverage. That's how sanctions work. And in the process, we've eroded the relationship itself. Putin's argument was that that's not in the interests of either side. What's interesting is he did not mention the word sanctions. He literally didn't say the word once. He was asked about sanctions, and his answer, I think as a matter of Russian pride, was essentially, we are not going to ask the Americans to lift their sanctions. In effect, that's their problem. What we're going to do is explore ways through businesses talking to one another, clearly with the sponsorship of the two governments, to essentially increase economic relations in the space we are allowed outside of sanctions. So it's a pragmatic approach. Some people might describe it as looking for a way to get around sanctions. At the end of the day, though, if there isn't an economic relationship at all, sanctions are not going to be very effective for leverage. So this may be in the U.S. interest as well as the Russian interest. So I saw a lot of substance, surprisingly, a lot of substance coming out of this bilateral meeting, but it did not come through the press conference, which was a disappointment. Last note is what happens going forward. I would be very surprised if the main takeaway item, if the main to-do item on each of the issues discussed by the two heads of state was not essentially for senior-level staff on both sides to have further meetings. I mean, that is almost as a matter of habit in government, the way that these issues are followed up. It's frankly appropriate because you want experienced career people like Jeff to take on these issues, and I suspect that will happen. It appears a lot of this on the U.S. side is in the hands of the National Security Council, which means John Bolton and his team. My hope would be that there are further meetings. We'll obviously get wind if those are happening, and hopefully they're going to move the ball forward, especially on these urgent security issues like Syria and Ukraine.
Thanks very much, Matt. I just want to remind the audience that if they're interested in asking a question, they should press *1 to join the question queue, and we'll be reviewing these questions and throwing it open to the audience shortly. But I want to ask a couple of questions to begin with. And I guess my first question is for Jill Doherty. And you talked about how Russia felt that after the meeting it was going to be a decider, and that it would have an opportunity to be a decider. But did you get the perception that, in light of what the issues that Matt raised, that something substantive was really decided at this meeting, or is in fact this is just going to be is it just going to be necessary to have the staffs discuss these issues going forward and see if something is coming on afterwards?
I was referring, Will, more to the, let's call it the perception rather than the reality. I do not think that Russia will be the decider. Maybe in Syria there's certainly a much bigger role. But I think, as I listen to everyone else, I think we all agree that we have to talk with Russia. We must on many of these issues. But the problem now, I think, is the disconnect between the people in the President's administration who do want to do that and who do, let's say, want to have these further meetings and maybe push the relationship back onto a better track. But the President himself does not present that in any form. He had no details, really, of what they discussed to speak of. And, in fact, you had the moment where I think Putin was presenting the U.S. position better than the U.S. President was. And so that is a problem, and because that type of lack of detail, lack of precision, lack of any type of information exacerbates the situation, and it turns it into a very simplistic, yes, we ought to talk to Russia, which turns into being, let's say, an apologist for Putin. It's a very strange dynamic, that disconnect. So I am a big proponent, actually, of talking with Russia. I think it's very dangerous that we are not. The period that Obama had, which was punishing Russia by not talking, is over. I think, we've made the point. It hasn't changed a lot in Russia to stop talking to them, and now it is time to talk. But the problem is how you do it, and do you have the best proponent of talking, not just saying, can't we get along, wouldn't it be nice if, but to give really specific ideas of how that could happen.
Thank you very much, Jill. My second question is to Matt, and it follows up on Jill's comment. You described the substance of what was described at the press conference, but as you rightly noted, it was Putin who was providing all the substance. So what substance do you think Donald Trump provided to this meeting?
Well, I think the meeting really served different purposes for both leaders. I think for Trump, it was a meeting about a meeting on two levels. If you'll recall the meeting with Kim Jong-un, that was a meeting about the meeting largely because of the unprecedented nature of an American president meeting with a North Korean chairman. So that was sort of demonstrating that a meeting can happen. It is a diplomatic statement, and then there's follow-up work to be done, as I said, on the working levels. I think that there was that element with this meeting. Not exactly identical, of course. There have been many, many summits between Moscow and Washington, but certainly in the recent past, it is somewhat unprecedented, and so it was a meeting about the fact of a meeting in that sense. But the domestic political aspect on the American side also makes this fundamentally different. This was almost, Will, I hesitate to say this to a constitutional law expert, but this was almost a constitutional matter. It was the chief executive, the diplomat-in-chief, the commander-in-chief of the United States of America, essentially asserting his right to conduct diplomacy however he sees fit. So having been warned in no uncertain terms by congressional Democrats, Republicans, almost anyone you can think of, you shouldn't have this meeting. I have to admit there was a sense in which the timing of the Mueller indictments just a few days before almost felt like a shot across the bow by the Justice Department itself. Like, don't have this meeting, here are a bunch of indictments to show you just how nasty these Russians are, you shouldn't go talk to them. And so there's a sense in which this is a meeting about proving the point that if the President of the United States wants to meet with someone, he can do it. And again, constitutionally, that's right, and I think he demonstrated that was right. The tragedy of both principles, of both points here, is that neither one appears very likely to lend itself to progress because of the lack of overall favorable context for U.S.-Russian progress.
Great. We're now going to go to our audience, and the first question, and it's from Paula Stern from the Stern Group.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. I am interested in asking your speakers, who were extremely helpful, and I thank you, about Ukraine. We are still trying to figure out what was said, but there was a reference by one of your speakers to sanctions. There could be more sanctions on Russia. But I'd like to ask about carrots as well as sticks, because the president alone could wield some carrots when it comes to Ukraine, and I'm wondering if you think that this makes any sense at all, since he's under such criticism for, at this point for the result of the Helsinki meeting, and that would be that he has within his wherewithal under Section 232 to give an exception to Ukraine, which is part of the wide sweep of tariffs that have been put on globally on all suppliers of steel and aluminum to the United States. So I'm wondering if y'all thought about his political position being criticized by some Republicans as well as Democrats and the press, that that there are things that he could do as opposed to just more sanctions on Russia.
So let's, Matt, you were the one who mentioned sanctions on Ukraine, so why don't you take a start at that question?
Sure. So let me start from the angle of what incentives or carrots Trump could offer on Ukraine. I think the starting position for U.S. policy, and Trump has really barely touched this issue. I mean, his focus on Russia has tended to be mostly about Putin, getting along with Putin. He's talked about arms races, arms control issues. He hasn't talked a lot about Ukraine other than to say that, had he been president, Putin would not have tried to take Crimea. It was because Obama was weak. I think he does have incentives to offer, and I think you're right to cite his executive authority to essentially rejigger almost any aspect of the existing sanctions regime, including the very tough sanctions which have been imposed subsequent to the passage of CAATSA, creating new sanctions authority, and also the existing SDN, Specially Designated Nationals lists, which have been used for Ukraine and other Russia sanctions. He can offer any number of carrots on that account, And he may be able, by that means, to secure some degree of Russian cooperation. The problem thus far has been that the two have not lined up, either in terms of timing or in terms of actual concrete interests on either side. So, for example, when it looked, 2 years ago at this point, as if we had something like a workable ceasefire to put in place, there were enough spoilers who were not interested in the ceasefire on both sides of the line. In other words, one side starts shooting, the other side claims self-defense and continues the shooting, and the whole thing collapses. That when people are shooting at each other and killing each other, arguing that you're making progress on an overall political deal is sort of moot. We've learned this in the Middle East after many, many decades. So I think the president's going to have a lot of trouble actually shepherding through any kind of resumed ceasefire or even getting to a big picture geopolitical deal. What I wouldn't expect is anything resembling carrots that go beyond kind of small steps for small steps. So people have talked about what they call the grand bargain, where Trump offers up some aspect of Ukraine in exchange for big Russian concessions on Syria, Iran, nuclear, whatever the Middle East issue may be. Look, we've had at this point 3 face-to-face Putin-Trump meetings. We've had a number of phone calls. We have had plenty of conversations between emissaries, including, Bolton and Huntsman and others. And not once has any credible indication that a grand bargain is on the table come out of those interactions. So my hope would be that we can kind of give up this grand bargain thinking. As a historical fact, grand bargains don't actually happen. What happens is a lot of smaller deals get put together over time, and in the rearview mirror, they add up to looking like a grand bargain. So I think you're totally right about small carrots vis-a-vis sanctions. Steel might be an area for that. I'd be very surprised if the president would go against his own overarching position on that, but certainly it's possible if he felt that he smelled the deal.
Before we move to the next question, did Jeff or Jill want to comment on the discussions about Ukraine and whether there was, any appearance in Putin's statements afterwards about flexibility in Ukraine, or whether this is still a very is any solution on the horizon on Ukraine?
Been thinking about carrots. What I would say is what we have to do at the same time is very clearly define what U.S. interests are at stake, what end state we're looking for. If that end state is something like Ukraine being able to choose its own strategic direction, that's just not going to happen with the way the Russians view this issue. This is a very, very personal issue for them, and I just don't see that happening. There might be small steps that can be taken to decrease violence and put something more permanent in place. But I think right now the Russians are fairly happy with the situation the way that it is, given that it's probably not going to get better.
And Jill, do you have anything to say?
No, I think that's fine. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. A reminder that if you want to join the question queue, please press *1. Our next question is from Tom Frank from Arab Weekly.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I'm wondering if any or all of you could talk about what you see coming out of this summit in terms of going forward as far as Syria and or Israel is concerned. Both were discussed. What do you see as the next steps? What do you see as the significance of what was reportedly discussed between the two? Thank you.
Who wants to start on answering that question?
I'd touch on the idea of some kind of overlapping interest in Syria. I think this is an area where we have overlapping interests with Russia and with Israel, and that's in preventing or getting Iran to cease and back up some of its building of militias and close to Israeli borders. But the problem is that I don't think the Russians actually have the weight with the Iranians to make that happen. It's not that they don't have a good relationship, but I think when you boil it down, that the Iranian concern over Israel outweighs its concern over its relationship with Russia. I think if you're in Iran, you're saying that, I'm going to continue to do this. What is the Russian reaction going to be? It's not as if the Russians are going to, in some way, downgrade their relationship with Iran because they're not willing to pull back these militias. So I think this is a big problem going forward. When I was in Moscow recently, I kept pushing them on this, and I'm not sure they've really engaged how bad this could be if Iran continues with its actions and Israel responds appropriately.
Thanks.
I would add to that. My understanding of the Russian view is that there is some degree of agreement, or at least coincidence in attitude towards the Iranian presence in Syria. The Russians don't like it. They're not happy with the idea that the Iranians are looking to establish some kind of base of operations, in or near the Syrian side of the Golan, to basically provoke the Israelis into the next big Mideast war. I mean, that's not a particularly helpful situation for a Russia that's trying to reestablish some degree of what it calls stability in Syria, obviously run by Assad, but with Russia as the big patron and Russia as the beneficiary of reconstruction. So if there was a way to get the Iranians out at essentially no cost to Russia, they'll take that out in a heartbeat. Thus far, the way to do that has basically been to let the Israelis erode Iran's capabilities on the ground militarily, and to look the other way and obviously, stand down their air defenses to permit that to happen. What I think might be a bridge too far for the Russians is to actually take any proactive steps against the Iranians, and that may be what the United States has been looking for. Putin indicated in his stand-up interview that basically the president spent a very long time on that topic and on the JCPOA, and that basically there was still a difference of view on that. One other Mideast-related topic that clearly came up that both leaders talked about was an interest in continuing to keep energy production high, not to have energy prices fluctuating too much, either up or down. And this seemed like a pretty obvious reference to Russian production and to Russian coordination with Saudi Arabia. So, whether the leaders are being totally forthcoming on that point or not, it sounded like status quo was what they had discussed.
Thanks very much, Matt. Our next question is from Michael Waller from the Wilson Center. Are you there, Michael?
Working groups that have been mentioned. Is there anything in the dynamics surrounding this meeting that would create a sense of urgency around any of these working groups? And if so, is there one of them that would lead and set the tone for the others? Thank you.
This is Jill. I'll just jump in quickly. I think certainly the nuclear issue is one. And it's something that both sides pretty much agree with, or at least have similar approaches. Let's say with New START, extending the New START agreement, I think there is an understanding. Certainly Russia feels this, and I think the United States, that it should be extended because it will be over in 2021. And it's a very important agreement in terms of limiting nuclear arms, both the warheads and the missiles that carry them. But also on the INF, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which deals with missiles, let's say medium-range missiles, etc. There's a great debate right now on both sides. Both sides accuse the other of violating it. And I think at least beginning a dialogue on that would be important. There might be some wiggle room that you could have both sides, beginning to discuss this. I think that would be number one. Cybersecurity, I don't think will move forward because of the obvious problem that it's connected to the interference in the elections. I think it's unfortunate because I do believe that cyber is something that the side should be talking about. In what format, I'm not even quite sure. It doesn't completely, it doesn't work the way nuclear weapons did. So that's, I think, a problem. But it is important. I don't think it's going to go anywhere. On the business groups, I do think that could be very important. But again, so many of the major groups, the people who are excuse me 2 seconds, that are, I'm in a hotel and they're knocking on the door, but I will ignore them. I do believe that the problem with a business group could be that many of the leading business people in Russia are actually under sanctions. And that is a problem. But business, if the United States and Russia did have more business ties, one could argue the relationship would be much better because there would be more interest on both sides to work together. With very little trade, very little economic interest, it's not a factor. It's not a stabilizing factor, and so you get back into these geopolitical and political issues that makes the relationship very rocky.
Thanks, Jill.
If I can, just one small point on working groups to Michael's question. There has been a working group on so-called difficult matters in the relationship, which was managed at the deputy minister level on the Russian side and the undersecretary level of state on the U.S. side. I always thought that was an important and potentially promising working group because it was really just about the technicalities of diplomacy. Like, for example, do we want to have consulates or do we not want to have consulates? Do we want to have protections for diplomatic personnel, diplomatic property? Do we want, for instance, our diplomats to be essentially, like medieval diplomats who were essentially hostages in the court of a foreign power? Or do we want them to be channels for information, negotiators, etc.? The answers to all these things are obvious, right? We figured this out over the last 100 years. It's very useful to have diplomats, embassies, consulates to provide citizen services, especially in the modern era where, with the World Cup, we had something like 10,000 Americans over in the Russian Federation. It's very helpful to have diplomats over there to provide services. Right now, I think the waiting time to get a visa interview, if you're a Russian applying for a visa to the United States, just an ordinary person who has nothing at all to do with high politics, is over a year simply because our diplomatic staff has been totally slashed by restrictions from the Russian side. This seems to me right now, it may not be the most urgent international security issue. It is the lowest possible hanging fruit, right? These are two major countries that have historically had very robust diplomatic presences on both sides, and we've been slashed to the just bare minimum. It seems to me that the sort of the ceremonial aspect, that the optics of kind of restarting some diplomatic interactions without agreeing on any substantive issue, it just seems like an easy win. I understand it might be taken as a concession, but, again, I just don't think having diplomacy in place is a concession.
I could say something on the arms control real quick. I completely agree with Jill. I think both sides want to see New START extended, and I think that's in the interest of both sides. My view on INF is a little different, and I'll admit that it's not probably the mainstream view. I think that the INF treaty is out of date. The reason the Russians violate the INF treaty is because they've identified a very significant military gap that they have. They don't have the long-range precision munitions that we do, or the numbers that we do, that we can provide from the air and from the sea that are not subject to the INF treaty. And so I really do not see them coming back into compliance. But what bothers me is that the INF treaty stands as an obstacle for us to actually negotiate new arms control agreements with Russia, which I think would be very productive. Like, we're not going to negotiate anything new while the INF treaty is being violated. So if we could both walk away from it with the understanding, okay, now let's start talking about something new, I think that'd be a constructive way forward.
But just to follow up on all your points, though, all the commentators have talked about the importance of these commissions and groups and committees and so forth. In a normal summit, though, these issues would be discussed before the summit, as opposed to trying to figure out what to do after the summit. So to what extent was this summit a bit premature, in a sense that the groundwork wasn't laid to kind of have these direct kind of follow-through items pursued, but was this kind of done ad hoc because President Trump really wanted this meeting?
This is Jill. I'll just jump in and I'll say that it's the latter. I really do believe that if this had been done as traditionally is done, obviously there would have been a lot more preparation. Things would be worked out in advance, kind of pre-cooked, and that's a good thing. That can be a very good thing. Then the presidents come in and can talk and have their own dynamic. But President Trump did want this meeting. Now, his critics would say it's all show. You can decide that as you want, but I do think he does deeply believe that he can go in and he can do deals and he can convince people to do certain things. The problem is that this is not Kim Jong-un, who is, a callow fellow internationally, although apparently pretty smart. This is Vladimir Putin, who's been in power for 18 years, who knows the issues inside and out, and came very well prepared with certain proposals. I think the key to it, again, we're back to this kind of disconnect between the president and his administration and his top officials. If this kind of shifted things and the people who are in his administration who can now begin discussions with Russia, it could ultimately be a good thing, I believe. But we don't know that yet. We'll have to see if they can at least begin talking. And but I do think the president wanted this. He wanted it to be very symbolic. Remember, when he came out and he talked with Putin, he gave almost no details. So I think he was more than happy simply to shake his hand, to talk to him behind the scenes. At least at this stage, that's, it would appear.
Can I just make one counterpoint on this, which is the relationship, the interrelationship between staff level preparation and then moving the ball forward and kind of high-level summitry, it's really a two-way street, and we've heard a lot about that from former Reagan officials and Bush 1 and 2 and Clinton and even Obama folks who have been in the press of late. There is a case to be made that in normal times where there is an atmosphere for real work to be done at the technical expert level, at the sort of mid-level and even the sort of higher political level in the two governments, that you had to have a summit to jumpstart all of that. Jill, you and I have been together in Moscow, and I know we've seen together this exact phenomenon where, Russian officials just won't open their mouths because they don't know what Putin permits or doesn't permit. And so I think, at least on the Russian side, when the signal is sent from the highest level that, okay, now it's okay to get business done, on this account and this account and this account, then it can actually move things along. And so in that sense, in principle, a summit isn't necessarily premature. A summit can come first and the work can come after. It just, not all summits are created equal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, our next question is from Tex Lembui, who is a student intern.
My question is there any monetary incentive between both presidents in regards to their personal relationships?
Did everyone
monetary?
hear that question?
Is there any monetary incentive between both leaders in regards to their personal relationships?
So the question is simply asking whether you're familiar with any sort of monetary and financial relationships between these two leaders.
Yes.
Okay. Anyone want to take a crack at that one?
Can you kill the sound on the questioner's line?
We're working on that.
Can you repeat that?
This is Jill. I would say I do not know of any. We do know, of course, that traditionally over the years, President Trump has wanted to build a hotel in Moscow, etc. But in terms of, a direct relationship, financial relationship between them, I do not know of any, and I do not know that there was anything like that discussed at this summit.
And as far as Putin, for all of his talk about Russian businesses want to get re-engaged with the United States, and there should be, dialogue between high-level business people. You should remember, the president of the Russian Federation, if you will, kind of the Tsar of Russia as a sort of timeless concept, is the wealthiest man on the planet, full stop. And the reason is because he controls the resources of the most resource-rich country on the planet, full stop. The notion that there'd be any kind of mutual financial dependency between him and anybody else, I think, is a bridge too far. A lot of people have a fantasy that there's this sort of Putin pot of gold at the end of the rainbow somewhere in a Swiss bank account. If we can just figure out where it is, then we can just really start to read his incentives and motives and what he's up to. I just don't think that works. I think he has absolutely everything he could possibly want financially. He controls the resources of Russia. And so in a sense, he is acting in what he understands to be the interests of Russia.
Jeff, you want to comment, or?
No, I don't have any knowledge of
the
personal financial part.
Okay, so obviously this press conference has created its own political storm in the United States, and that has obviously dominated the news cycle in the aftermath. And the substance of the meeting, which all three speakers have talked about and identified, is really kind of fading into the background. So my question is does Trump really have an ability to follow through on the long list of things that Putin raised, or is he going to be overwhelmed by the optics and the political controversy that has ensued as a result of this meeting?
Well, I think, to Joel and Matt's points earlier, what I find interesting about this administration, I have since the beginning, is that there does seem to be this space created beneath the president for his, for the people in the administration to actually move forward on Russian policy. There's actually been quite a bit of Russian policy passed since President Trump came into power. And my hope is that even if this turns into, if this political storm keeps churning, based on the press conference, that the contacts that were made, great people like Fiona Hill and others, will still have that space to, engage in some kind of constructive dialogue.
And this is Jill. I'll just jump in and say that on the nuclear issue, arms control agreements, getting back to INF and New START, those would be two things that I think could proceed if they're handled correctly. That I don't think a lot of people would say we should not have an agreement like that, with Russia. That even politically, I think Trump's biggest opponents or enemies would certainly agree that that's an important thing to do. When it gets into the more complex ones, like the business agreement, I think that might be a little bit harder, as I said, because of people who are under sanctions. You never know, though, because there I still do. I agree with Jeff to a certain extent that there, beneath the surface, you have some really good people. Fiona Hill is one of them, definitely, who can continue to do what they are doing. And hopefully now that at least the signal has been given from both sides, that perhaps they could work on other aspects of cooperation.
What I would add to that is I think we may be observing one of these periodic sea changes in how American foreign policy is made, which is the antennae of Congress have gone up so high and have stayed up on anything related to Russia, and I think that there are spillovers from that to anything related to NATO in Eastern Europe, anything related to nuclear issues, anything related to cyber issues, that I think we're going to see Congress's role in American foreign policy making, period, extended. Whether that amounts to Congress actually being able to pass a foreign appropriations or defense appropriations bill that, contains actual policy, that's harder to predict. But it has historically been the case that in the latter part of the 20th century, the executive branch led foreign policy, and that was an adaptation to the realities of a changing world technologically and in terms of time and communications. But there's no reason why things couldn't shift back. Congress has all the capabilities it needs. It certainly has, tremendous powers under the Constitution. The president is diplomat-in-chief, so if he wants to have a meeting, he'll still be able to have meetings. But Congress really controls the purse strings and the ability to declare war, and so I think we are going to see a kind of constitutional rebalancing because Congress seems to have the will to do it.
My last question is to Matt, but to the other speakers as well. You mentioned that the press conference was a time of missed opportunities, and that the questions were predictable and repeated. So my question for you is, what questions did they not ask that you thought would be most appropriate and could have illuminated the discussions more?
That is an outstanding question. Well, thank you. I would have asked right out the gate. I would have said, is each of you prepared to ensure the continuation of basic nuclear arms control transparency and inspections between the United States and the Russian Federation by extending New START by executive action. So that would extend it from 2021 to 2026. So we would at least have an arms control treaty in place, even if, as Jeff says, maybe we can't do much about INF. Second, I would have asked them, what is each of you prepared to do to stop the fighting in Donbass and to ensure that the Minsk agreement is fully implemented? And to contrast their side-by-side statements would be very interesting. It probably would have given us a window into whatever this interesting proposal that Putin noted actually was. And then on Syria, I would have asked for a lot more detail. What is their expectation as to how the situation in southern Syria can be stabilized? Is there a post-ISIS scenario that is also some kind of scenario for managing an Assad exit, or are we going to get on record the presidents of the United States and the Russian Federation basically saying Assad is it? I would have put them on the spot on questions like that instead of basically just asking over and over the objection in a courtroom would be asked and answered, and I think we got that kind of over and over on Russia meddling, collusion, whatnot.
So Jill and Jeff, last questions or final thoughts?
Well, I have a lot of trepidation about where we're going after this. I think it does. Unfortunately, Matt, I think you are too educated and too intelligent to be a journalist, because you wanted to ask substantive.
I seldom get backhanded compliments like that.
But I do think that right now the question that most people would want to know is, what did you just say, Mr. President? And that is going to be the level of discussion for a while, and I think it's going to complicate the ability of anyone to bring this down to rational thought. My feeling has been since the beginning of all of this that it immediately we leap to the emotional level instead of a very sober, concrete way of talking about issues. It happens on both sides, but I think here in the United States we have to take responsibility for what we are doing. And right now, it's not a detailed debate. It is highly emotional and very simplistic in black and white. That doesn't serve us well, and I think it could make relations even worse than they are.
No, this is Jeff. I would totally agree. But I do think it was a missed opportunity for the administration, and that I think that the president could have confronted Putin with the election meddling, could have acknowledged it and said he agreed and understood what the intelligence community has said, and I think the Russians would still talk to us about the pragmatic steps we need to take forward. So this again, like I said in the beginning, this dichotomy between whether or not we acknowledge, the Russian meddling versus working with him is one that I think is unnecessary.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to bring this discussion to an end. I'd like to thank Jill, Jeff, and Matt for all their points and discussions. Thank you also to Jane Harmon for introducing today's event, today's Ground Truth Briefing. And we'll no doubt be holding more of these in the future as events warrant and transpire. So thank you very much.